In the middle of April of 1945, everything was falling apart. On the Seelow Heights, the German defense could no longer hold. Heinrici asked to retreat, but from Berlin the order was to resist. Meanwhile, Soviet tanks kept advancing. Berlin was only 70 kilometers away, and yet it acted as if the front were still far. But it was already on top of them. Inside the regime, everyone did what they could. Himmler moving on his own, Goebbels pushing for no one to surrender, Speer trying to save what little was left. No one knew who was in charge. Orders arrived late or contradicted each other. In many streets, there was no one giving orders. Berlin was still standing, but something inside had already broken. How were those last days of the Third Reich lived? Greeting a corpse in uniform. On the 20th of April, 1945, Adolf Hitler turned 56 while locked in the Chancellor's bunker as Berlin became a field of ruins. Outside, the cannons of the First Belarusian Front could already be heard with ease in the heart of the city. The Soviet artillery had begun firing from positions less than 10 kilometers from the center. Berlin was surrounded by 3 enemy fronts. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere was tense, forced, almost ceremonial. At 11 in the morning, a small group of high-ranking officials entered the antechamber of the shelter to greet the Führer. There was no celebration, only a line of extended hands, some mechanical greetings, and a hunched Hitler with a vacant look, barely maintaining eye contact. He appeared as an old sick man. Among the officials were Goebbels, Bormann, Dönitz, Keitel, Jodl, Krebs, and the new head of the Volkssturm, Hans Fritzsche. None of them still had any illusions about the military situation. Just meters away from that greeting, the maps showed that the fall of Berlin was a matter of days. While that was happening underground, bombs fell incessantly on the surface. The troops of the 8th Soviet Guards had crossed the Oder and were advancing towards the Marzahn district. The T-34 tanks made their way through the rubble of Lichtenberg, while the Luftwaffe could no longer respond. The few remaining units had either dissolved or were on the brink of collapse. The Vistula army group was unable to hold any stable line. Joseph Goebbels, who had moved his family to the bunker the previous day, took charge of maintaining the birthday ritual. He brought his 6 children, impeccably dressed, to greet Hitler, who received them with a dim smile. It was the last family gesture to be seen inside. Soon after, Hitler locked himself in his personal room and did not leave for hours. Eva Braun tried to fill the space with empty jokes, but no one paid attention. Meanwhile, Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, arrived unexpectedly from Hamburg. He had taken a special plane to Rechlin, and from there a secret train to the heart of Berlin. He entered the bunker without warning. His visit was not just symbolic. He wanted to speak with Hitler face to face to stop the order to destroy all infrastructure before surrendering. Speer knew this would condemn millions and sought to reason with him. He did not succeed. The conversation was short and tense. Hitler insisted that if Germany did not survive, neither should its industry. Outside, the Volkssturm, composed of old men and teenagers, had been ordered to cover the center. Many had no training or real weapons. Some carried old rifles or rocket launchers that failed. They had never shot before. They were placed behind barricades made of overturned trams, burned cars, and loose bricks. That same day, the slogan, "Resist until the end," was reaffirmed across all commands. Any retreat without direct permission was prohibited. The improvised tribunals continued to operate and carried out immediate executions for defeatism. Several officers were executed for attempting to get their families out or proposing surrender. At the subway stations, control posts were set up to prevent attempts to escape to the west. The reports coming from the north and west were equally bleak. The American troops were already beyond Magdeburg and Leipzig, less than 150 kilometers from Berlin. The Brandenburg region was overwhelmed with refugees fleeing on foot, between bombings and out-of-control troops. Some were executed for not staying in their homes. In that climate, Hitler received a report from General Heinrici, head of the Army Group Center. He warned that Berlin could not resist for more than a week. Hitler discarded it. He gave orders to reorganize phantom divisions and launched a supposed counterattack from the south with troops that had no fuel or real connection. In his mind, victory was still possible. As night fell, Soviet artillery intensified its pace. Shells hit the Tiergarten, unter den Linden Avenue, and near the Anhalter station. The roar was incessant. The civilian population hid wherever they could: tunnels, basements, bricked-up passages. Many families had been without water or electricity for days. Rations were thrown randomly from moving trucks. The distribution network no longer functioned. At the command post of General Weidling, in charge of defending the city, the most vulnerable points were discussed. It was concluded that the south would not hold. The panzer were destroyed, and there was nothing to reinforce them with. Weidling requested to move units to the center. He was told that this would be considered treason. In the last report of the day, Goebbels read a phrase in front of a few: "The Führer is firm in Berlin. The Soviets will fail as they did in Stalingrad." No one responded. Some pretended to listen, others lowered their gaze. The gap between what was said and what was happening was unbridgeable. The day ended without ceremony. In the bunker, Hitler had dinner in silence with Eva Braun and 2 attendants. Outside, the fire marked the sky of Berlin. Just a few kilometers away, the Soviets were advancing without stopping. The regime's last birthday had no toasts or speeches, only ruins, smoke, and a city on the brink of extinguishing itself. Arrows on maps that no longer worked. On the 21st of April, 1945, the day began with the sound of Soviet artillery constantly hitting the eastern suburbs. At 6 in the morning, units of the 5th Shock Army entered via the Königs Wusterhausen Road, and by 9, the first house-to-house combat erupted in Friedrichshain. In less than 3 hours, Berlin's Defense Command lost control of the eastern access points. The city was officially divided into isolated sectors. In the Chancellor's bunker, Hitler received a report that marked a breaking point. General Heinrici had authorized a partial retreat of his troops to avoid total destruction. Hitler exploded. He shouted that it was a betrayal, that no one was obeying orders, and that command had collapsed. His anger caused him to fall slumped in his chair, with a pale face and irregular breathing. It was the first time those present saw him completely unbalanced. From that moment on, he began to dictate plans that made no practical sense. He ordered that the 12th Army, under Wenck's command, turn north and break the encirclement to free Berlin. This unit had been retreating from Magdeburg without fuel or heavy artillery and had barely any communication lines. Hitler demanded an immediate advance that could not be carried out. General Jodl tried to explain the limitations, but was interrupted. Hitler insisted that a surprise blow would break the Russian encirclement and restore morale. No one contradicted him. Meanwhile, the Soviets were closing the ring from the north. Troops from the 47th Army took Bernau and were preparing to cut off access to Pankow. The Havel bridges were blown up by retreating German units. The route to Reinickendorf was destroyed. Thousands of civilians tried to cross on foot between crossfire and explosions. The center of Berlin began to fill with refugees arriving with nothing but a backpack on their shoulders. The subway stations collapsed. At the same time, Heinrich Himmler, from a secret base in Lübeck, activated a negotiation with the Swedish Red Cross to establish an informal contact with the Western Allies. He sought to open a channel for a partial surrender of northern Germany, behind Hitler's back. The message was intercepted by British services and leaked to Dönitz. Internal distrust increased. Goebbels ordered a special broadcast on national radio. It was said that Berlin would resist like Stalingrad, that each building would be a fortress. He called on the population to trust Wenck's counterattack. The propaganda continued to use heroic language that no one believed anymore. The eastern neighborhoods were a hell of smoke, ruins and bodies. On the 22nd of April in the morning, the situation worsened. The 3rd Soviet Armored Guards succeeded in penetrating from the south, from Köpenick. They took control of the railway crossing at Ostkreuz. The Nordland Division, composed of foreign SS volunteers, was sent to contain the advance. They were wiped out in less than 5 hours. The fighting left hundreds of civilians trapped in shelters. In the bunker, the maps were increasingly red. Hitler no longer met with the High Command at the usual table. He ordered reports to be delivered directly to his room. He only spoke with Bormann and Goebbels. The communication room received more than 300 messages per hour, but most were evacuation requests or confirmations of losses. None brought relief. During that day, Hitler formally appointed Helmuth Weidling as the commander of Berlin's defense. Until then, Weidling had been considered a traitor for suggesting a tactical retreat. Now he was put in charge without consultation. He was given outdated maps, a malfunctioning phone, and a fractured command structure. His only resource was to improvise with whatever he had in the city, Outside, the last reserves were running out. The remaining armoured units were distributed in groups of 3 or 4 per sector. There were no spare parts or enough fuel to operate for more than one day. The defence was organised with whatever was available: SS commandos, scattered infantry groups, some snipers stationed in buildings, and hundreds of Hitlerjugend teenagers. That night, columns of smoke and distant explosions could be seen from Tempelhof Airport. St. Hedwig's Cathedral had been hit by indirect fire. The historic centre was in total chaos. The ambulances could not keep up. The hospitals were operating at half capacity or were empty. In the west, reports indicated that the British had already passed Hanover and the Americans were taking positions near Dessau. The encirclement of the capital was complete. But in the bunker, Hitler spoke of an imaginary offensive. He claimed that Steiner would counterattack from the north and that Wenck would support him from the south. Neither had the capacity nor logistical contact to do so. These were unsupported plans, pure illusions. During the early hours of the 23rd, Lieutenant Colonel Nicolaus von Below, Hitler's personal aide, wrote in his diary that he had never seen him so disconnected. He only spoke to his secretary. The rest of the staff were ordered not to approach unless it was urgent. There were no more gestures or discussions, only isolated instructions and looks that avoided crossing. Meanwhile, the report spoke of lost sectors, broken positions, and entire divisions erased from the map. But in the hallways, new advance routes were still being drawn with arrows on old maps. The war was still happening in the offices, even though nothing was left outside. April 23, 1945, Berlin with no way out. April 23rd began with communications completely overwhelmed. Over 400 encrypted messages per hour were sent from the bunker to regional commands, most of them without response. The remaining working phones were used to confirm the names of missing officers. Many of them had already been captured, wounded, or disappeared amid the chaos. The telegraph operators worked without relief. Several collapsed from exhaustion that very morning. Goebbels, now permanently based in the Chancellor's office, began issuing directives as if he were the civil chief of Berlin. He ordered the organization of surveillance groups in each neighborhood to detect potential defeatists. Each street command was given lists with names of suspects. From local officials to regular neighbors who had been denounced, the command was clear: immediate imprisonment or summary execution. In less than 24 hours, more than 200 people were arrested for creating panic. In parallel, the military justice system set up rapid action tribunals in the basements of official buildings. A major, a clerk, and a soldier would decide in less than 10 minutes the fate of each accused. Most were convicted for cowardice in battle. Sentences were carried out at the side of the same building. There were no appeals. That very morning, a group of 8 soldiers was executed on Wilhelmstrasse for retreating without a written order. The resistance inside Berlin was a disjointed puzzle with no coordination. Some sectors had Volkssturm groups, others had SS battalions, and in many cases they clashed due to command confusion. Radios were not working in most of the northern part of the city. Orders arrived late, or didn't arrive at all. In several areas, neighbors took control of the air raid shelters without waiting for instructions. In these conditions, Lieutenant General Weidling tried to establish a command post in the Tiergarten area, but most streets were blocked by rubble. It took him 5 hours to cover less than 3 kilometers. When he finally set up, he discovered there was no way to communicate with most of his subordinates. Radio contact was lost within minutes. The city was divided into combat zones with no clear lines of control. In the bunker, Hitler received an encrypted notification from Berchtesgaden. Hermann Göring had sent a telegram suggesting that, according to the decree of 1941, he should assume power in the event of the Führer's incapacity. He requested authorization to act as the head of state. Bormann intercepted the message and presented it as an attempt at an internal coup. Hitler, furious, ordered him to be dismissed from all positions and arrested immediately. The news spread throughout the bunker within minutes. Many interpreted Göring's message as an inevitable step. The command structure was completely fractured. Some high-ranking officials began to destroy documents. Others tried to send encrypted messages to their families. The idea that the end was near had already become a consensus. In the south of the city, Soviet troops took control of the Tempelhof district. The former commercial aviation terminal was rendered useless. The hangars were set on fire after several direct hits. Urban infantry troops advanced with flamethrowers and explosives to clear buildings. The German defences, scattered and poorly coordinated, were unable to stop the advance. That day, more than 70 fires were reported in residential areas. There were no firefighters available. Many hydrants had been destroyed by bombings, and the streets were impassable. The smoke prevented visibility beyond 20 meters in many areas. The ambulances that were still functioning avoided approaching the fiercest combat zones. Some wounded were transported in wheelbarrows or broken bicycles. In the Moabit area, an improvised resistance formed with what remained of the railway battalion. They were reinforced by railway workers armed with pistols and dynamite. They temporarily halted a Soviet advance for 6 hours, but were wiped out by nightfall. None of the senior commanders knew about this action until they were informed of its annihilation. The Gauleiters from several regions began to disappear from the map. In Pomerania, Saxony and Thuringia, the local leaders abandoned their posts without informing anyone. Some fled to the west, trying to cross into areas occupied by the British. In other cases, they were intercepted by their own troops. The Reich's administrative apparatus no longer existed as such. Decisions were being made in isolation, often without consulting anyone. In the Chancellor's office, Eva Braun organized a private dinner with some of the remaining female staff. They prepared what they could find: hard bread, canned goods, and a couple of bottles of wine. Amid the smoke and tremors of the ground, there was even forced laughter, a kind of absurd bubble in the midst of the general collapse. Goebbels ended the day by giving an improvised speech in a basement room. He stated that Germany was in its most glorious hour, that it would resist until the last cartridge, and that the enemies would not know victory. No one applauded. The echo of explosions cut his voice off several times. Just a few meters away, the supply staff were destroying reserves and files. When the day ended, there was not a single safe escape route from Berlin. The roads were cut off, the trains stopped, and the airfields were neutralized. Only ruins, small combat hotspots, and a city with no direction remained. Leaving was no longer an option. Only resisting whatever came next was left. The day Himmler tried to surrender in secret. April 24th dawned with the first clashes at the Landwehr Canal. The Soviet advance, which until then had been frontal, now moved through urban corridors. The troops of the 3rd and 5th Shock Armies began to split into small groups trained for combat within buildings. They went door to door, throwing grenades on stairways, blowing up reinforced access points, and burning basements with flamethrowers. The goal was no longer to take streets, it was to clear each block, room by room. By 11 in the morning, clashes were reported at Nollendorfplatz, where a section of the 11th SS Nordland was holding out at the Sachsenhof Hotel. Crossfire destroyed 3 city blocks. A Soviet tank entered the backyard and fired directly at the kitchens. Hundreds of civilians were trapped in the basements with no water or air. No one came to rescue them. While this was happening in Berlin, in a country house north of the city, Himmler was meeting with a Swedish emissary connected to British representatives. He offered a partial surrender in exchange for controlling northern Germany. He wanted to present it as a move to stop the Soviets. The message was encrypted and sent to Sweden. The British rejected it outright. The information about the negotiation reached Berlin through a double agent. When Bormann learned of it, he handed Hitler a handwritten note. He did not react immediately. 3 hours later, he ordered all of Himmler's positions to be revoked and for him to be declared an enemy of the state. An arrest was also ordered, though no one had the means to enforce it. That afternoon, Speer made a final tour of key Reich buildings. He went from the Ministry of Armaments to the Lehrte station to prevent the boilers of the central heating system from being blown up. In a meeting with mid-level commanders, he begged them not to follow the orders to destroy infrastructure. He said Hitler was sick and misinformed. Some listened, others did not. That same night, 3 factories in Siemensstadt were blown up by direct order from the War Commissariat. In Mitte and Kreuzberg, the fighting did not stop. The Soviet troops advanced along the canal edges, while the German defense used the subway tunnels for movement. Combat took place on platforms, stairways and ventilation shafts. Gunfire was constant. The walls were covered in soot and blood. Civilians mixed with fighters. No one asked questions. At the Moritzplatz station, a Soviet brigade was trapped for 8 hours under crossfire. They tried to blow up an exit on the U8 line, but the collapse of a tunnel forced them to retreat. They eventually exited through an emergency route. The fighting left dozens of dead on both sides. On the surface, the bodies piled up on street corners. No one touched them. In the bunker, Hitler was already sleeping during the day and awake at night. His meetings took place between 2 and 5 in the morning. The lights were kept on at all times. The air was dense. The generators failed. The air conditioning didn't work. Some slept in the hallways. Goebbels reinforced control over the civilians. He ordered the formation of neighborhood defense committees to patrol, clear debris, and report anyone who seemed demoralizing. Flyers were printed in mobile presses and circulated through streets still controlled by the SS. The message was clear: survive without surrendering. In the emergency hospitals, doctors worked without supplies. There was no electricity. Amputations were performed without anesthesia. Bandages were washed and reused. At the Friedrichstrasse hospital, more than 400 wounded were treated in a single day. Many were children or the elderly, crushed in debris. The building had been hit 3 times and was functioning only in the basement. On the night of April 25th, the Soviets reached Anhalter station. From there, they deployed toward Potsdamer Platz, where the German forces defending the path to the Chancellor's office were located. Explosions were continuous. Windows exploded. The streets shook with every impact. Berlin was already a fire corridor. In those hours, General Heinrici was dismissed as head of the Vistula Army Group. He was removed for refusing to launch a suicidal counterattack. He was replaced by Kurt Student, who never arrived to take command. The command structure was broken. Orders didn't reach their destinations. The lines were dead. The radios were out of batteries. By the end of that day, the Soviet encirclement had fully closed. From the east, south and north, the armored columns were less than 2 kilometers from the center of power. Only scattered barricades, snipers without bullets, and piles of smoking ruins remained. There was no longer any strategy, command, or coordination, only chaos, fire, and people shooting instinctively. Potsdamer Platz breaking point. At 6 in the morning on April 26th, the Potsdamer Platz crossing became the epicenter of urban combat. The Soviet troops of the 8th Guards launched an assault from Anhalter Bahnhof and advanced along the Tiergarten. The defense consisted of scattered remnants of the SS, some teenagers from the Hitlerjugend, and snipers stationed in half-collapsed buildings. The fire did not stop all day. Bullets hit entire walls and shells passed through several walls before stopping. A Soviet squad was trapped in an abandoned movie theater with old propaganda posters. They tried to escape through the back, but a machine gun unit ambushed them from a balcony of the Esplanade Hotel. 2 T-34 tanks entered the street and fired relentlessly. In less than an hour, the intersection was covered in dust and debris. That same day, another Soviet column made a breach through Wilhelmstrasse. From there, they were able to partially surround the government district. For the first time, the bunker was within direct artillery range. From then on, all movement within the complex had to be done underground. No one went up anymore. Goebbels ordered the activation of public loudspeakers with pre-recorded messages. Phrases like, "Victory is in sacrifice," or "Berlin will not surrender," echoed. Almost all the speakers were out of service, and the few that worked were drowned out by explosions. Still, the propaganda teams insisted on connecting portable generators to keep them running. Meanwhile, Bormann reorganized the internal workings of the bunker. He removed unnecessary personnel, centralized all documents, and ordered the destruction of papers that should not circulate. Decisions were being signed simultaneously. Sometimes 2 people gave the same order without knowing it. Phones rang to confirm things that had already changed. Amidst the chaos, a group of Hitlerjugend attempted to recapture a position near Leipziger Strasse. They were 14 boys between the ages of 14 and 16. They attacked with old grenades and rusty rifles. They managed to knock out a machine gun but were surrounded. Only 2 returned. The rest remained lying among the ruins. No record or burial was made. At the Charité Hospital, a bomb collapsed 2 floors. The operating rooms worked by flashlight or candlelight. The hallways were flooded with water mixed with blood. Nurses carried the wounded through blocked stairways. There were no beds. Broken doors, boards, or chairs were used. In the subway tunnels, movement was constant. German troops used the U2 and U6 lines to move below ground and attack by surprise. On one of these exits, they destroyed a Soviet armored vehicle near the Belle Alliance Bridge. The counterattack blew up the entrance. Hundreds were trapped in the darkness. In Schöneberg, the neighbors organized by buildings. There were shifts for cooking, guarding, and cleaning. Some made explosives with bottles and nails. Others sealed gaps with old mattresses. 1 bucket of water was shared by 20 people. The remaining food consisted of dented cans, mouldy bread and boiled water with ashes. There were no more escape routes. Gatow Airport had been bombed that morning, and the last liaison planes were destroyed. At the Zoologische Garten station, the rails were melted. No one talked about fleeing. The only option was to resist a few more hours. From his command post, Zhukov sent more reinforcements to finish the encirclement from the south. New infantry divisions and fresh artillery arrived. The maps were updated with red zones every few hours. Only 3 areas remained untaken: the Chancellor's office, the bunker, and a few buildings in the center. When no one knew who lived next door, the morning of April 27th began with a series of explosions that knocked out the power grid in central Berlin. An artillery shell had hit the transformer station on Invalidenstrasse. The city went dark. The radios stopped broadcasting, and the phones went silent, even between units fighting a block away. Berlin was split into isolated sectors, with no way to coordinate anything. The German commanders tried to keep operating with messengers. Inexperienced soldiers ran through debris with papers that were stained or torn. Many fell before they could reach their destination. Others became disoriented among unfamiliar streets. No one knew if the neighboring unit still existed. By mid-morning, the 3rd Soviet Tank Guards reached Spittelmarkt. From there, they split the Mitte district in 2. Resistance north of the canal was completely cut off. The mortar shells made the walls creak. In several sectors, soldiers took cover behind dead horses. No one buried anyone. The civilians were beginning to break. In the shelter schools, they separated the children into groups, not knowing if they would ever see them again. In Prenzlauer Berg, some neighbors broke through a wall to move into the neighboring building and escape the fire. Each entrance could be a trap. On the Moltke Bridge, a group of Germans tried to retreat to the west. The crossing was partially destroyed. Only a twisted strip of metal remained. Soviet artillery detected them and opened fire. Several bodies were left hanging between beams. The others crawled back as best they could. In the bunker, there was nothing but bad news. Each report brought another defeat, another gap in the front. Strategy was no longer discussed. Only reports were heard, nodded to and followed. Meals consisted of dry crackers, cans opened with force, and sour wine. Some slept wherever they could. Others locked themselves away and did nothing. The few who worked did so in silence. The female staff organized to keep the bunker clean. They used rags and water carried in buckets from an improvised supply. No one knew how much was left. Some wrote letters that would never be sent. Others slept on the floor on whatever they could find. Outside, the fighting was no longer for streets, but for buildings. The Soviets were perforating interior walls and advancing floor by floor. In every corner, there was someone. An old man with a rifle, a kid with a grenade, a woman shooting from a window. The front no longer existed, only areas where firing still took place. Goebbels didn't stop. He sent more leaflets and messages through messengers dressed as civilians. He repeated that Hitler was still in charge and that a counter-offensive was coming. Many knew it was a lie, but some repeated it anyway. In many areas, no one knew if there were still SS, armed civilians, or anyone giving orders. In Wedding, civilians were forced to pass ammunition hand-to-hand between 2 ruins. They did so without protection, under direct fire, and not knowing who they were doing it for. Some tried to escape. They were shot on the next corner. It was no longer discipline. It was the fear of being killed on the spot. Near Gesundbrunnen, in an empty brick factory, a German platoon refused to continue. Their captain accused them of insubordination and called for an expedited court. 2 hours later, 3 were shot in the loading yard. The rest returned to their positions without speaking. By the Spree River, the Soviets set up new artillery pieces. From there, they bombarded the government zone every 20 minutes. Some buildings collapsed without being directly hit, just from the constant shaking. The streets filled with dust more and more. To breathe, many soaked rags and tied them around their faces. By the end of the day, the feeling was clear. Berlin was no longer a city. It was just scattered, disconnected pieces where no one knew who lived next door. The radio said nothing. The phones didn't work, and the footsteps heard were only from those who still had to move, knowing it could be their last stretch. When the Reich broke from within, April 28th began with the bunker turned into a boiling pot. The hallways were filled with noise, rapid footsteps, broken voices. Early in the morning, one of the communication officers handed Bormann an intercepted message. It was a broadcast from Swedish radio informing that Heinrich Himmler had made contact with enemy representatives. They named him. They said he had offered the surrender of northern Germany. Bormann went straight to Hitler. He didn't soften the message. He told him that Himmler had betrayed the Reich, that he was trying to pass himself off as the new leader to negotiate with the Allies. Hitler didn't react immediately. He sat still, staring at the paper. Then he exploded. He threw the document against the wall and ordered the immediate arrest of Himmler and his entourage. At that moment, he also ordered Fegelein, Himmler's liaison with the bunker, to be arrested. He was in his room. He had tried to change clothes and leave disguised. He was dragged down the hallway. Goebbels and Bormann took advantage of the chaos to gain total control of internal communications. They shut off access to the radio. Only messages approved by them were allowed to be broadcast. Any attempt to send information without authorization was punished as sabotage. An operator was detained for forwarding a distress message to a trapped unit. No one knew what happened to him. On the surface, the situation was a disaster. The Reichstag was already surrounded by Soviet troops. The mortar fire was constant. Every attempt at a counterattack from within was stopped by crossfire. The entrances were blocked by tons of rubble. The remaining German soldiers moved between broken columns, flooded hallways and piles of bodies. The red flag had not yet been raised, but the building was already a trap with no way out. In other sectors of the city, the Volkssturm continued to fight in ridiculous conditions. Many fighters wore improvised uniforms, without helmets or boots. They fired from wooden windows with rifles from World War I. Some barely knew how to load the weapon. On a corner of Alexanderplatz, a group of bakers armed with shotguns held out for 3 hours. They all died before reinforcements arrived. Water had already been completely cut off in several neighborhoods. People used buckets to collect rainwater or melted ice. The toilets had collapsed. The smell of decomposition was unbearable in many shelters. The unidentified bodies were dragged to the courtyards and covered with tarps. No emergency services were functioning. The little that was left was used to transport wounded officers or documents. On the Landwehr Canal, a Soviet section attempted to cross on an improvised bridge. A mine hidden under the planks blew it to pieces. The bodies fell into the water amidst machine gun fire. Despite this, other soldiers continued to cross where they could. Boats, logs, swimming through shrapnel. Each meter taken cost dozens of lives. The city swallowed everything, leaving no room for pause. In the bunker, Fegelein's interrogation was brief and brutal. He provided no information. He kept repeating that he wanted to leave, that he knew nothing, that he had no contact with Himmler. He was taken to another room. No one ever saw him again. In the hallways, it was said he had been executed, but there was no official confirmation. The atmosphere grew even more suffocating. No one trusted anyone. They spoke in whispers. They looked around before saying anything. The internal phone system collapsed by mid-afternoon. A power line was cut by a bombing and left several underground facilities without energy. Only a few portable radios with 20% battery remained. They were only used to send coordinates or request cover fire. The messages were hand-coded. The codes changed every hour, but many didn't receive them in time. It became common for units to fire on their own reinforcements by mistake. In the Friedrichstrasse sector, an entire building collapsed after several artillery impacts. 6 floors fell like a house of cards. Inside were civilians and soldiers. No one could get out. The dust covered 5 city blocks. People emerged from the basements with their hands raised, not knowing where to run. At that point, the flag didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was surviving the day. That night, gunshots were heard from Moabit to the Tiergarten Park. There were no front lines, only points of fire, quick footsteps and screams. The Soviets began using loudspeakers to call for surrender. They promised fair treatment to those who laid down their arms. Few believed them. At the other end of the city, an entire unit of German soldiers surrendered en masse. They were disarmed and made to dig trenches. Hours later, they were sent back to the front without explanation. On the roof of a burning building, a German soldier raised a white cloth tied to a broken bayonet. No one responded. A few seconds later, a burst of machine gun fire brought him down without warning. He fell backward, without screaming, and the cloth hung from the metal pole as if no one had ever seen it. At that hour in Berlin, surrender was no longer an option anyone could understand. Basements and ruins. April 29th began without the sky. The city was so covered in smoke that the dawn was invisible. The daylight was only noticeable by a slight change in the tone of the ruins. The streets were still filled with smoke, fire and bodies. People no longer walked, they crawled, stumbled, dragged themselves, searching for a corner where they could remain alive for a few more hours. The basements had become parallel cities, each one held dozens of trapped people. Some had been locked in after collapses, others had chosen them as their final refuge. Muted cries, footsteps above their heads, distant explosions shaking the walls could be heard. Oxygen was running low. The candles consumed the little air left. There were children asleep on rags and old people staring into nothingness. In the bunker, the routine was mechanical. Meals arrived on aluminum trays, often cold or inedible. The reports were repetitive. No improvement, just setbacks. That morning, Hitler met with some of his closest collaborators. He handed them documents with instructions for later. He offered no explanations. He only spoke for a few minutes, then retreated to his room and did not leave for the rest of the day. The heaviest fighting was concentrated in the Reichstag and the Chancellor's office sector. Soviet infantry was entering through cracks, sewers and side entrances. Every room was a battlefield. The Germans had set traps, explosive wires and mines. Every floor gained was lost minutes later. There were no defined front lines, only noise and death. Conditions in the hospitals were inhumane. In Kreuzberg, a nurse took her life after working without sleep for 60 hours. Half of the medical buildings had been evacuated or destroyed. Those still functioning did so without light or medicine. Many patients lay on cold floors with open wounds and no care. Those who could walk helped the others. Those who couldn't simply waited. In the bunker, Bormann continued overseeing the destruction of documents. Papers were burned in portable stoves, and files were put into boxes to be destroyed later. Sparks flew through the vents. Everything that could compromise someone was silently disappearing. Some officers wrote encrypted messages that they then tore into pieces. In an old school in Schöneweide, a group of German soldiers took cover with a machine gun and enough ammunition for a few hours. They held out until the building collapsed from a bombing. The walls exploded outward. Several civilians who were in the basement died in the collapse. No one knew how many combatants were inside. Only legs could be seen between the bricks. Soviet soldiers took positions in half-destroyed buildings, using broken furniture as cover and firing from windows with no glass. One of their main objectives that day was to cut the subway tunnels to prevent the Germans from escaping or moving troops. On the U6 line, they placed explosives along several sections and blew up key access points. In a collapse, dozens of people who weren't fighting died. They were simply crossing. At the zoo, what was left of it, several animals roamed loose. A bear was shot by a German patrol when it approached. The monkeys had died from starvation days before. The aquarium was dry. Soldiers used the place as an observation post. No one spoke. They just aimed, fired, and retreated. The walls had chalk inscriptions, names, dates, curses. In the afternoon, a group of Soviet soldiers found an abandoned radio transmitter. It still worked. They broadcasted a short message announcing the imminent fall of central Berlin. The message was intercepted in the bunker. No one responded. There was no longer the capacity to do anything. Only the recording of what was happening remained. Goebbels dictated propaganda texts to his secretaries. He said the people were resisting heroically, that the invaders were paying for every meter with blood, that Berlin was an example of bravery. No one listened to these messages. Not even those who wrote them believed in them. It was just a mechanical reflection of a system falling apart in real time. At the Anhalter Bahnhof train station, a German unit tried to blow up a train full of supplies to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. They didn't manage to plant all the explosives, and the fire only affected part of the convoy. The Soviets entered hours later and recovered documents, maps and weapons. Most of them were burnt. At the intersection of the U6 and U2 lines, a Soviet assault unit found a collapsed tunnel halfway, with overturned wagons, bent tracks, and smoking cable remnants. They went down an alternate access without knowing if Germans were waiting for them. They advanced, crouched for over 100 meters, guided by rusty flashlights and following a hand-drawn map someone had made on an ammunition box. Upon reaching a junction, they found an open door with an inscription on the wall, Archiv. They didn't know what it was. They entered silently and discovered a rectangular room with collapsed bookshelves, broken furniture, and thousands of papers scattered on the floor. It was an underground library, once used as a municipal archive. The soldiers walked among piles of burnt books. In a corner, next to a half-broken wooden desk, there was an improvised anti-tank battery mounted on an iron base welded to what used to be a reading table. It had been cobbled together from parts scavenged from other equipment. Next to it, 2 SS soldiers' bodies were curled up as if they had fallen asleep. No one fired. No one shouted. The squad commander pulled out a notebook, wrote down the position and marked the wall with red chalk. Then they left in single file, without looking back, leaving everything as they had found it. Outside, the U-2 line continued to shake under the bombings. The advance didn't stop. They just noted another lost room among tunnels, cables and ruins, as if what had happened there no longer mattered to anyone. The last sound was a phone. At 5 in the morning on April 30th, the thunder never stopped. Soviet tanks were stationed in front of the Reichstag, firing non-stop. The facade was nothing more than a hole-riddled wall. Inside, German soldiers continued firing from what was left of the columns or from gaps between debris. No one responded to orders. Each group defended itself as best as it could. In the Chancellor's office, the entrances were blocked with broken furniture, desks thrown across the hall, and old filing cabinets nailed shut. Inside, nothing made sense. The stairs leading down to the bunker were filled with people, some with makeshift bandages, others sitting silently, messengers with dirty papers, typists waiting for instructions that never came. No one asked what to do anymore. Outside, the gardens were destroyed. There was no clear path. The Brandenburg Gate was far behind, and the Soviets kept advancing building by building. Each house was marked with red chalk, sometimes with a letter, sometimes with insults, sometimes with names. Each symbol served a purpose. In the subway tunnels, a group of German soldiers improvised a battery with tram parts. They fired toward the street through ventilation holes. It barely slowed the advance for a few minutes. The Soviets responded by launching fire through the entrances. In the basements, many had stopped trying to escape. Some were trapped. Others had locked themselves in alone. In several buildings, survivors wrote the names of those inside with charcoal. It was the only thing they could leave behind if everyone died. In the Mitte district, some Hitlerjugend boys tried to move a cannon. They couldn't. They were under 15 years old. A sniper saw them, and a few minutes later no one was left on that corner. No one approached. The windows closed as if nothing had happened. In the bunker, written orders were no longer passed. Everything was whispered. Those who were still there knew it was the end. Some continued typing on old machines. Others simply sat in the hallways. No one had a specific task. Everyone moved aimlessly, as if there was still something to do. Goebbels and his wife were locked in a room with their children. The girls were either asleep or sedated. Water was being heated in the kitchen, though no one used it. The air was thick. No one entered that room. No one wanted to walk through that door. On the surface, the Soviets had already taken control of the Tiergarten Park. From the rooftops of the Chancellor's office, they placed machine guns to stop any movement. A German tank came out from a side street and exploded before it could turn the corner. Smoke poured in through all the windows. In the old Ministry of Aviation, a few defenders remained who had surrounded the entrances with wires and explosives. When the Soviets entered, there were a few shots. Then, silence. Upon entry, the bodies were piled up, some with their eyes open, as if waiting for something. The civilians still in the buildings no longer knew whether they should hide or leave. Some hung white cloths. Others raised their hands, not knowing whether they would receive help or a bullet. There were no clear rules. At the Stadtmitte station, a German unit surrendered without firing a shot. They were led in a line down Friedrichstrasse. People watched them from the doorways. No one said anything. No one applauded. They just watched, as if seeing defeated soldiers was now part of the scenery. It was already night when the sky turned completely red. It wasn't the sunset, it was the fire. Everything that burned made the temperature rise. Some thought it was a heat wave, but it was the asphalt melting, the pipes bursting, the roofs collapsing. In the back of the Chancellor's office, the Soviets opened a room that had been sealed with cement bags. They used explosives. Inside, there were papers scattered, furniture overturned, maps stained with dried blood, and 2 phones ringing, one after the other. No one answered them. The soldiers stared at them for a few seconds and then left. Outside, one of them drew a sign with red chalk. Zakończeno, finished. It was 12:17 a.m. on May 1st. There were no screams, no applause, only smoke and a marked wall. On May 2nd, 1945, after 10 days of crossfire, collapsed buildings, and steps moving aimlessly from one basement to another, a group of Soviet soldiers reached the ruins of the Reichstag and climbed the destroyed facade without waiting for orders. One of them planted a flag between broken bricks, hanging cables, and fresh blast marks. No one said anything. No one stopped to look. In the streets, some civilians were still hiding behind mattresses or dragged furniture, while others ventured out, not knowing if what they were hearing was the end or the start of another attack. The city remained covered in smoke, with empty windows and hallways filled with suspended dust. There were no factions or announcements left, only bodies, remnants, and a thick silence that explained nothing. That's how those days ended. With everything lost, too many trapped in a war they never chose, and a city that didn't surrender, it just faded away.